Good evening. My name is Donna Bowles, and I'm the president of Charlotte Wildlife Stewards, and we welcome you to our program tonight, which is on frogs. Excuse me. So I think we've got a lot of people that have signed up for this, so it's everybody must love frogs. So our mission for our chapter, we're one of 19 chapters of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And I know there are a lot of people on this program that are from in different places in the state. So I encourage you to look for those chapters that might be in your area. If you go to the NCWF website, there is a page that has all the chapters listed. So I encourage you to look that up and think about getting involved with those local chapters. In Charlotte, our mission is to create, protect, and preserve wildlife habitat through education, engagement, and enjoyment. We're an urban environment, so we lose lots of habitat every day, and we work, trying to counter that. So one of the things that you can do, whether you're in Charlotte or North Carolina or any state in the country, is create a wildlife habitat. And our speaker, Alvin Braswell, will talk about this a little bit more in his presentation. But all wildlife needs the same thing we do. They need food, water, place to raise their young, and shelter. We also encourage sustainable practices, especially not using pesticides. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. Are you a member of NCWF? If not, you can, as I said, look up those chapters on their website. There are listed over here some of the benefits. They send out this quarterly wildlife journal that has great information in it. You do get membership in your local chapter. You get a little bit of swag, and then monthly you get this Wildwire newsletter that has lots of good information in it about wildlife and then things that are happening across the state. You get to be with other people that have the same interests that you do, and that's always a lot of fun. And you get the other thing NCWF does is they work a lot in Raleigh with our government to work to protect wildlife and make sure that is happening. So one of the events we have coming up here in Charlotte is a trash cleanup in a wildlife sanctuary, and we're partnering with our stormwater services to do that. So we're about full, but if you're in Charlotte and you want to come by and do that, we certainly welcome you. If you're in another community, they may be also having, their stormwater services may also be having some kind of a cleanup week. I know in Charlotte we're having Creek Week, so it's a whole week of events. So look that up in your community. The other thing I want to highlight is our fundraiser that we have every year, except of course for the past 2 years we did not have it. So on Saturday, June 4th, we're going to have our Wild on the Water. It's a guided paddle. We have some kayaks and canoes available, or you can bring your own, and you can even bring your, if you have a stand-up paddleboard, work. We do this on Mountain Island Lake at Latin Nature Preserve, and we're in the process of finalizing our registration form for that, and that'll be coming out the end of the week. If you're in Charlotte or the Charlotte area and you'd like to come out and support our chapter, I encourage you to watch for that. And then finally, the programs that we have coming up in the next 2 months are shade gardening with native plants. That's always a challenge. What am I going to grow in the shade? And Lisa Tompkins will be here with us. She is the owner of Carolina Heritage Nursery, and she grows exclusively natives. And then our May program is with Carolina Headwaters on snakes. So these folks are herpetologists. They are expert on snakes, and this will be an in-person program. We probably will have a hybrid, so we'll probably have it also online, but you want to meet these snakes in person because they will be there, and they're ambassadors. They're wonderful. I met some of them this past weekend. So I encourage you to watch for our social media post about that, as well as it will be in our newsletters. So now I'm going to turn the program over tonight to Alvin Braswell on the frogs of North Carolina, and I'm gonna have to read this bio because it was a little too much for me to memorize, but it's very impressive. So Alvin is originally from Union County, right next door to us. He received his Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife biology with a botany minor and a Master's of Science in zoology from NC State. He has served in the U.S. Army, and currently he is retired from the North Carolina State Museum of Natural Sciences, where he spent over 40 years in various curatorial roles with reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fishes before being the research lab director, and later assuming a deputy museum director for operations position. In that deputy director role, he was instrumental in the planning, construction, and operations of the Nature Research Center wing of the museum. I hope to get there one of these days and check it out. Now, Alvin is the emeritus research curator position with the museum, but now he has returned to his primary love, which is being a field biologist. He served over 20 years in the Plant Conservation Program's Scientific Committee and chaired that committee for 5 years. He's also served on the Non-Game Wildlife Advisory Committee for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission for over 25 years. And he's chaired the Scientific Councils for Amphibians and Reptiles and Freshwater Fishes for periods during that time. As an adjunct instructor at NC State, he co-taught herpetology for 17 years. In his retirement, he is not slowing down, let me tell you. He's involved with Friends of Plant Conservation, Carolina Wetlands Association, Tar River Land Conservancy, North Carolina Herpetological Society, Wake County Parks and Recreation, and Open Space, Triangle Land Conservancy, various research projects with the North Carolina State Museum of Natural Sciences. As an avid photographer, he shares his photos with various conservation organizations for both educational and promotional purposes. And he's received, as you can imagine, numerous awards and honors throughout his career. So we're so happy to have you, Alvin, and look forward to this presentation on these charismatic little guys that I've always loved. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
All right. Well, thank you. I was hoping you would shorten that intro a little bit, but okay, I appreciate it. What I'm going to do initially is, before we get into a PowerPoint on the frogs, give you a little bit more of an introduction to the frogs. This is a wonderful group of critters that once you start to know them a little bit, it's hard to stop wanting more information and creating places for them so you can see them more often. North Carolina is blessed with 31 species of frogs that are currently recognized as occurring in the state. And these are in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 families. And the Hylidae is the largest family. But the Ranidae down here has most of the large frogs that people are most familiar with. So I have shared this document and a couple more that I'm going to show you. Here, let me stop that share and bring up this one. And because this is the Charlotte chapter, I did a listing of the frogs, the 5 families that are represented in the Charlotte area, and with some comments about how common they might be or not in the area. And we'll go more into aspects of natural history of these species in the presentation. And let's see, one more thing I want to share, because this will be some information sources. Oops, wrong one. Try again. So get it right. Third time's or second time's the charm here. Some references. one of these available because it's hard to, on a computer screen, when these are up just a little bit, to click on them. So it's something that I think you can request and get copies emailed to you. And a couple of books up front that will be useful: Amphibians, Reptiles of Carolinas, Virginia. I've been involved with both editions of that, co-author on this most recent edition, 2010. And then the Peterson Field Guide to Amphibians and Reptiles of Eastern and Central North America. Be sure you would go for the 4th edition, the 2016 one. There are many editions before that, but that's the most updated one. And I like that because they did more research into putting together the range maps than most field guides do. And they have them somewhat more accurate as a result. There's a number of websites that will help with identification and information on amphibians and frogs. Herps of North Carolina is a good one, supported now by partners in amphibian and reptile conservation. The North Carolina Herpetological Society has accounts of species to help identify them. AmphibiaWeb, if somebody really wants to get into what's current known about the most up-to-date taxonomy and stuff, that is a site you can go to and search on individual species or geographic areas. If you want to help with what occurs where around, you should check out the Carolina Herp Atlas project. That gives opportunity for citizens to send in observations they have about where things occur, and it's a group of people that help to verify the observations to be sure they're accurate. Wildlife Resource Commission has species accounts that are useful, and the Museum of Natural Sciences has the Ask a Naturalist program, where by clicking on this link you can fill in your information about who you are and what you want to have a question about. And if the people in the Naturalist Center can't answer it, we have a host of professional curators. And if the museum staff can't answer it, we certainly know a lot of people outside of that can help answer most any question about our natural systems. A couple frog call websites, Frog Survey, North American Amphibian Monitoring Program. And then if somebody really wants to get into things and like identifying tadpoles, which can be quite a challenge, there's a website here that will help get you into that. All right. With that, let's get started here. Okay, I'm going to run through pretty much all the 31 species here and give you some comments on each of them, and then get more into some other interesting things about creating some habitats, and hope to have a good bit of time at the end here to answer questions that people have. And so let's get started. Can everybody see that okay? Donna, are we good?
Yes, it's good.
It looks great.
Good.
All right. Okay. I will lead off with a little comment about the American toad. This is the one calling here, and here's an amplex pair. I took this photo last night. That little bit of a rain that we had come through, because we had very little rain here, the toads had not had a good opportunity locally to get started. The American toad is the first of our toads to breed in the season. And early in the day, before it rained and the real warm wind was blowing out of the south, there were lots of these toads scattered out in the woods and fields around here calling. I guess they were anticipating that there would be some rain later, and they were just having trouble waiting. Well, when the rain did come through, I walked down to a little pond that's created behind the house. I'll talk more about that later. And I stopped counting at 40 American toads. And the pond was literally full of toads. And then there was amplex pairs, and got fresh eggs today in the pond. So it was a wonderful night for the American toads. The distribution of frogs in North Carolina is not uniform across the state. Frogs as a group are more common in the south, more in the tropical, subtropical areas. And in North Carolina, you see a reflection of that. In the coastal plain, we have 29 species that occur. The sandhills here, which is almost very much coastal plain-like in some respects, is 27 species that occur there. In the Piedmont, it drops down to 25, but you have to, if you want to look at true Piedmont species, 9 are marginal coastal plain species that get over into the edge of the Piedmont. And then there's 1 in the west, northern mountain species that gets into the edge of the Piedmont there. So you really only have about 16 truly Piedmont species. In the mountains, it's even less, 11. 1 spadefoot record way back in Cherokee County in a Piedmont-like habitat. You subtract that, then you say you've got about 10 species that are mountain species. First of our toads we'll look at is in the family Scaphiopidae, excuse me. That might seem a little strange to some that are used to frogs. They thought they were in Pilobatidae. Well, with some of the new genetic works, all the frogs that were in the genus Scaphiophus have been, not all, but some have been split out into genus Spia. And if you go in southwestern United States, we have 3 or 4 species of Spia that are still in the Pilobatidae. But the Scaphiophus, we have only this one, and it's in that new family name. And they used to be more common. A lot of the ephemeral wetlands that they require for breeding have been drained. And so in the Charlotte area, they used to be there. I would love to hear about recent records of them there. They're called spadefoots because of the little spade on the back feet that they help to, it helps them to dig back in. They burrow in, spend most of their life underground, and pop up on wet nights and eat insects. And this is a species that is an explosive breeder with big rain events. You get one of those 3, 4, 5-inch rains most any time of the year, and they're likely to pop out of the ground and lay their eggs and have a breeding episode. Talk a little bit about American toads to lead off. This is a species that is common in most of the Piedmont, a little of the upper coastal plain, and it's common in the mountains. In the Piedmont, they seem to alternate a bit with the Fowler's toad, which we'll talk about in a minute, as the dominant toad in a given area. The American toad is more of a woodland species, whereas the Fowler toad seems to deal a little bit more with open habitats and not quite so heavily wooded. But you see color variations here. All of our toads exhibit a good deal of individual color variation. And a single toad, like this red one, can't change to brown, but it could change to different shades of red, more pronounced or less. And but there's individual color variants confuse a lot of people with identification. They think that, well, this toad that's brown and this one that's red must be different species. Well, no, that's not the case. There are other characters you look for. On the American toad, the cranial crest, these ridges on top of the head, the size of the warts, the number of dots inside a black spot American toad, usually it's 1 or 2, maybe 3, but usually 1 or 2 that are inside a black spot. And then you have them that there are no black spots, but they have big warts back here, and they have a nice cranial crest. Our smallest toad is the oak toad. It's a coastal plain species, and body length about 1 inch or so. Small one, longleaf pine ecosystem, ephemeral ponds, or places where they breed. And they have a call that sounds very much like the spring peeper call. But they're later in the season, where spring peeper is a more late winter breeder. The oak toads are late spring, summer breeders. And we have the southern toad, which is another large toad, equivalent in size, pretty close to the American toad. The American toad females are the largest of our toads in the state. But southern toad is a coastal plain species, comes up into the sandhills and gets into the edge of the Piedmont, even here in southern Wake County, just a little south of Raleigh. They have not as quite large warts on the back, but they're bigger than the Fowler's toad, and they have more dots in some of the dark spots. They have these cranial crests with a large knob on the medial edges of the crest, and these are going to be even more pronounced than the ones I'm showing you here. But they're a species that is a early, late winter, early spring breeder in the inland areas, but you get in coastal places, they can be aseasonal, and some can breed most any time of the year you get a big rain. So you get geographic variation in some species in the time of year that they breed. This is an amelanistic albino up here that had come in some years ago. That sort of thing can occur in most any species. So it happens on occasion. I think the animals are at a disadvantage because they're much more visible to predators. That's probably one reason that such anomalies in color are not that common. So one thing I should mention here, you noticed probably that I used bufo, and there's various species with the new genetic techniques. Some genuses have changed. And Anaxarus is the new genus of our toads that were in genus Bufo in North Carolina. But because most field guides that people have a few years on them, and Bufo is the name that's going to be in there for the genus. So what I've done in these various listings is I've put these new terminologies in parentheses so that you'll have them, but trying to keep a name there that is familiar. If you've got a field guide on your shelf, that is likely what you'll have in that guide. Now to the most common of the toads in the Piedmont of North Carolina and in the Charlotte area. Excuse me. No, down in Union County where I grew up, I couldn't find any American toads. It was all Fowler's toads there. And excuse me, just why I'm not sure. But Fowler's toad, the warts on the back are typically smaller. There are more dots in the dark spots. The cranial crests are small, much smaller than they are on the American toad or the southern toad. And these frogs breed typically about a month after the American toad or the southern toad breed. So whereas those two are late winter, early spring breeders, Fowler's toad tends to be more middle of the spring. Once in a while, and we may have that this year because our lack of rainfall, the seasons can get pushed together. And occasionally we have some hybrids between the American toad and the Fowler's toad show up. The hybrids apparently are sterile, and after about 3 to 5 years, they usually are out of the population. But while they're there, the male's call is about halfway between American toad call and the Fowler's toad call. So you can hear them in breeding choruses when you have a good ear for frog calls. The northern cricket frog is a common species throughout most of the Piedmont. They don't get very high up in the mountains. They're in the northern coastal plain, and then there's a southern cricket frog that they overlap a little bit in their distribution. But in the Charlotte area and most of the Piedmont, it's going to be the northern cricket frog, which is a little thicker bodied, a little rounder nose, a little shorter legged, more webbing on their feet, and highly variable in their colors. You pick up or see 6 of them around the pond, chances are all 6 of them will be slightly different colors. Yellows, greens, gray, brown. They do have a triangle between the eyes. This one it's hard to see because of the green pigment, but there is a triangle in between the eyes. These are small frogs, inch to inch and quarter body length, and have a call that sounds very much like a cricket call. And later on, I have some frog calls I can play to illustrate some of these calls. We won't get into that right now. This frog, as with the southern cricket frog, have the ability to be around semi-permanent and permanent ponds and breed there as long as there's fairly good vegetation and leaf litter and stuff in the ponds so that the tadpoles can avoid fish. There's the southern cricket frog, coastal plain and eastern edge of the Piedmont. Less warty, more leggy, has a more pointed snout. Okay, our official state frog is the Pine Barrens tree frog or Anderson's tree frog. It's a coastal plain, southern coastal plain, sand hills species in North Carolina. Some spots in South Carolina, in Georgia, of course, Panhandle of Florida, and then Pine Barrens in New Jersey. Disjunct pockets of this species where it occurs now. Obviously, it was much more widely distributed sometime in the past. And just exactly how far back, hypsothermal period, warm moist period, after the last glaciation, maybe. They're really beautiful frogs, have nice clean cut lines, which help identify them from some other species, the gray tree frog and the pine woods tree frog juveniles. Recent metamorphs can be greenish in color, but they don't have these nice clean cut margins on their color patterns. This is a species that copes fairly well with fairly acidic situations. It breeds in semi-permanent bayhead and precocian pools. Lots of sphagnum moss around. If you check the pH of some of those waters, they're usually down anywhere from 3.8 to 4.5, somewhere in that range. That seems to be the habitat they prefer for their breeding. Now, here's the tree frog that probably most of you are familiar with, the gray tree frog. We have 2 gray tree frogs in North Carolina. Cope's gray tree frog, which occurs over almost the entire state. And then there's a few counties right along the Virginia line where we have the gray tree frog, versicolor, that's been documented. The 2 look almost identical. They have different genetic makeup, different number of chromosomes, but the Chrysoceros, Hylochrysoceros, Cope's gray tree frog is the one that you're likely to run across. And highly variable in color again. This individual could go from this standard sort of gray with some dark markings on it to virtually white in color. It could go to almost brown color. The white spot under the eye is a good mark to help identify them. Even a recent metamorph has a white spot under there, even though it's got a green back on this one. And you almost never see adults showing this greenish color in North Carolina, at least. This is a species that adapts well to urban and suburban areas, as long as there are places for them to breed and you've got some forest around. They prefer hardwoods. Oaks are one of their favorite trees, I think, but mixed pine hardwoods, they occur in them in good numbers. Have them here in the ponds we've built by the hundreds. I will play you a recording later that will make you want to put your fingers in your ears. So they're a really neat frog, and one that if you build a habitat, chances are they will come. But they're fish intolerant. They need fish-free waters for their breeding. Their eggs float on the surface of the pond where they breed. There'll be little clumps of them, and they're sort of a gray-brownish color. And I'll point out the difference in some types of eggs as we go along through here. But their eggs are not in clumps like many frogs make them. They're in surface filled on the pond. Green tree frog is a fairly large, slim tree frog. Most of the ones you see are going to have this nice white line on the side of the body, which helps identify them. But every once in a while, you'll see one that doesn't have that white line. But this is a species that has expanded its range in the last 20 years or so and moved more northerly and more inland with our warmer winters. And it's a species that copes with fish quite nicely in permanent waters as long as there's fairly extensive emergent and submerged vegetation. They love cattails. And if you have a big lake and there are green tree frogs there, most any time during the day in the warm season, if you get out on a boat, a kayak or canoe, and get up into the edge of the cattails, you can see some sitting on the cattails. They're a good hitchhiker also. They occasionally will get on vehicles. They like to come to lights at night, and the street lights, and people park their vehicles under them or around the house, park their vehicles near a light that's on at night. You're likely to have a green tree frog that if you're traveling the next day, may be going with you. Pine woods tree frog. This is a southern species that comes up in southeastern North Carolina and gets into the edge of the Piedmont just barely. It's more of a longleaf pine ecosystem species. It breeds in ephemeral pools and those type habitats. This is one that over the years we've had many people that see a young one that's green and they mistake it for that pine barren street frog. As you can see, those clean cut edges are just not there on the pattern. So, again, the adults don't show this greenish color that some of the young ones do. This species does have, back if they straighten the leg out, there's nice orange spotting in there. So when one jumps, those orange spots are very obvious. And then when they land, they close up and it disappears. It's, I think, a good technique they have for avoiding predators. The predators go around looking for the orange spots it just saw, and they're gone. Our largest tree frog is the barking tree frog, and this is another one like the green tree frog that has moved a little further north and more inland. The first ones in the Raleigh area turned up around 1980, 81 or so, and now we probably have a half dozen sites in the county where they're documented from. I would not be surprised that some are showing up in the Charlotte, Union, Cabarrus County areas on the eastern side of the Charlotte area. Again, this is one that if they do occur, it would be good to have reports of that so that we can track their distribution better. Okay, The ace hitchhiker of all these tree frogs is the squirrel tree frog. 2 years ago, I was out at Buxton and stayed at a place where these were very common. I drove back and I had 5 of these that I found around my car when I got back to Raleigh. And one of them escaped, and it turned up for the next year. It was around my back door at the light at night. It would get on the door chasing insects, and then it disappeared. But because of that hitchhiking propensity they have, there's been a number of small occurrences of breeding populations that popped up in the eastern to the central Piedmont. So I would not be at all surprised if some squirrel tree frogs are over in the Charlotte area. It's a relatively small species, up to maybe inch and a half. I don't think one would reach 2 inches in body length. Like I say here, one of the characteristics of them is a lack of distinguishing characters. This green one and this sort of brown one over here could easily be the same frog. Within a relatively short period of time, they can change color to that magnitude. Normally, if you find them by day, they're brownish colored, and at night, when they're up around a light, they're usually green. Ephemeral fish-free ponds for breeding. Rare species, and known only from a far western North Carolina, a couple counties, is the mountain chorus frog. They used to be considered a more widely distributed species, but with some genetic work, it was split into 2 species. So in field guides, you'll see mountain chorus frog, Pseudacris brachiofauna. Well, the one we have in North Carolina now is not brachiofauna. It's Collins's mountain chorus frog, Pseudacris collinsorum. To find them, this is the time of year you would want to be back in Cherokee or Clay County and listening at night on a wet, rainy night. They're probably calling nicely right now back there. Okay. In this same group, this is Pseudacris, chorus frogs. We have Brimley's chorus frog, coastal plain species. No records of them in the edge of Piedmont. There used to be one record in the Sand Hills, and they haven't been reported there for some years now. It looks like the range has shrunk down, and we're somewhat concerned about that. If you still go out around from Lake Waccamaw in the south to Phelps Lake, the Pocosin Lakes area up around Albemarle Sound, there still are common species up there, and they'd be calling right now. And they're a late winter to usually finish by early spring in their breeding. Nice clean cut frog, clean lines, very attractive little frog. One that most people are familiar with is the spring peeper. These start calling sometimes in November, December, with sort of a warm, rainy period. They're breeding right now. The calls are very distinctive. That peep, and they use a lot of ephemeral ponds, but they can breed in permanent lakes too if there is good vegetation around the edge so the tadpoles can avoid fish predation. But this is a nice adaptable little species that is extremely common in the mountains and the Piedmont and in a good portion of the coastal plain. Various colors again. Individuals will be different shades. The X mark on the back is given the name Crucifer. Sometimes it's not quite as clear as X, and sometimes one will be bleached out so much in its color that you won't be able to see that. But this one and this one are both females, and you can see the eggs through the translucent side of the body here. These lay their eggs singly. in ponds, and so it's hard to find the eggs lots of times. They just go around dropping an egg here and there, attaching it to some vegetation or leaf litter. Whereas most frogs, the eggs are a bit more obvious, and clumps are floating in surface fields. Southern chorus frog, a species that some might confuse it with brimleys, but they're gray and not the brownish color of the brimleys, and the lines are more ragged and broken up, and uneven edges on them. This is another species that uses ephemeral semi-permanent wetlands and has decreased a lot in its numbers in recent years, and we're somewhat concerned about them at this point. Seems like with all the development that's going on, it's common to go back to a site where they used to be, and the site's not there anymore. So, our smallest frog is the little grass frog, Pseudacris ocularis. Body length from about ½ inch to maybe just a slightly more than that. Have a little cricket-like call that most people think it's just a cricket calling when they hear them in a roadside ditch. And they don't need big spots, but ephemeral fish-free wetlands for breeding. It can be as like a roadside ditch. They do get in barely into the eastern edge of the Piedmont, but mostly a coastal plain species. Our largest chorus frog is the ornate chorus frog, and this is one that we are very much worried about because it's lost most of its breeding habitat, and it's a state-listed species. They're reddish, greenish in color. That varies a good deal, but the spotting is pretty consistent on this species. This is a winter breeder. They will be calling in January, up in the middle of February, typically. But much of their habitat has been lost, and so we are seriously worried about this species' continued existence. Upland chorus frog is the one that we won't have in the Piedmont. They can be quite common. They don't need deep water at all, ephemeral spots, and that will hold water in the spring or late winter up to the middle of the spring or so when the tadpoles get big enough to metamorphose. They have a call that sounds kind of like dragging your fingernail over a comb, the teeth on a comb. And they lay eggs in little clumps. Once they're fully expanded, it's about the size of a silver dollar. So if you're not paying close attention, you won't even notice them out there. But nice little frog. And they're still calling some now, but most of their breeding has already passed this year. The narrow-mouthed toad. A friend of mine calls it the narrow-minded toad because they specialize on ants to eat. They're very narrow focus. I suspect they eat a good deal more things, but small stuff that they can get in their mouth. But they do love ants. They have a tough skin. They're about an inch long or so, maybe just a tad over that on a big one. They have a nice little pointy nose. There's a fold right across the back of the head, right behind the eyes and skin. It might help to identify them. They have a call that's kind of a nasal, and there's a relative of theirs further west called the sheep frog. The call sounds kind of like the bleat of a sheep. These can be quite common, and recently, until we worked on the driveway, they would try to breed in puddles in our driveway. Go out after a rain, be dipping out the eggs to keep them from getting sloshed out when we drive through. But they take advantage of flower pots with a little water in it. They got a tray with some carnivorous plants in it or something. They will jump in there and lay their eggs. Their eggs float on the surface of a pond the same way the gray tree frog eggs do. Now we'll switch over to the ranid frogs. The gopher frog, Rana, now Lithobates is the new genus. There's still some argument in the scientific circle about whether that's appropriate or not, or whether it still should be Rana, but the new field guides, a lot of them are listing as Lithobates genus. This is a federal candidate species. It's state listed as endangered. It's one I've done a lot of personal research on and trying to track down all the historic sites and find new sites. The Wildlife Commission now, a biologist there, and some folks at the zoo are working with them. This is a frog that acts more like a toad. They live up in the woodlands, down in a hole, stump hole and stuff, except when they go to a pond to breed. And that's usually in February or up to about middle of March. And they lay their eggs in fairly large clumps, 2,000 to 3,000 eggs in a clump. Tadpoles hatch and grow fairly rapidly. And usually they're metamorphosing in about June to July at the latest. Out. Little metamorphs like this, a little over an inch in length. They have a dorsolateral fold. I'll mention that with some others to help it identify ranid frogs. That is a ridge that runs down. This is the dorsum, this is the lateral side, so dorsolateral, halfway in between is this fold of skin. It goes back from around the eye back towards the vent. Some species have it and others don't, and it helps as an identifying characteristic. This is a wonderful frog that has so handicapped itself by its needs for breeding sites and where they live. It's a longleaf pine ecosystem species to a large extent in the southeastern U.S. North Carolina is the northern extent of the range, and that has shrunk down. They used to extend up around Beaufort, and those sites have been drained, and no longer any indications they're there. They used to be fairly common in the Croatan, and sites where they used to occur there, most of them, they don't occur anymore. So you get back down to Camp Lejeune and then up in the Sandhills a little bit, and back down towards Wilmington, there's still some pockets where they occur. But people are working hard to try to improve their plight and protect sites for them. Okay, everybody knows the bullfrog, I think. This is the largest of our frogs. They're relatively fast-growing, short-lived frogs, hedonistic bullies that eat anything they can get in their mouth. They're noted as the frog that for people to go frog gigging and get them and eat the legs, which can be quite good. They are very fish tolerant. The tadpoles live right in ponds with fish and apparently taste nasty, and fish won't eat them. And they're in the international trade. Some they breed and raise them over in China and ship them back to the U.S. To sell here in food markets. Unfortunately, what comes back with them is some diseases. The bullfrog is relatively tolerant of chytrid fungus, which kills a lot of other amphibians. Well, they carry it, and it doesn't seem to bother them. So, but they are common pretty much statewide. They've been introduced out on the Outer Banks. About in the early 80s, they started showing up down around Buxton. Probably bait bucket, who knows, they got there somehow. And up into the higher elevations of the mountains. So they're statewide. The tadpoles almost always have to overwinter once to get big enough to metamorphose. In some of the slower growing places, particularly up in the mountains, they may overwinter 2 or 3 times before they get big enough to metamorphose. A real common frog that usually volunteers itself in any kind of yard ponds that people create and is the green frog. A couple subspecies, the green frog and bronze frog, they're the same species, Rhinoerythemades clamitans. They can range from sort of a bronze color to more of a greenish color. Nice dorsolateral fold that the bullfrog doesn't have. Like the bullfrog, the males have a larger tympanum than the females, which helps distinguish the sexes on them. Tadpoles typically need to winter or overwinter once to be big enough to metamorphose. But these things travel overland readily and will establish themselves in most any pool or pond, at least on a seasonal basis. If you've got a fairly large yard pond, they will actually, that holds water constantly or permanently, they will breed in it. And they're a nice frog and native, so they're very common in my backyard. The river frog is a large species, second only to the bullfrog in size for North Carolina frogs. It is one that is state listed endangered and may not be. We haven't been able to find any in the state since July 1975. Back when we were putting together the first edition of the Amphibians and Reptiles in the Carolinas and Virginia, we needed one for a photograph. So I trotted down to the Scotland County on the Lumber River, the site where we've always been able to find them. And there was this nice big female sitting on the bank. So I collected it, brought it back, photographed it, and put it in the book. That's the last one we've seen in North Carolina. That is something I'm not proud of, but you never know. They do occur, go a couple counties deep into South Carolina, and they still are there. And we keep hoping that they will recolonize back into North Carolina. The pickerel frog is a common species. Most of the coastal plain, all the Piedmont, and up into the mountains, at least in the lower elevations. This is a species that is very fish tolerant. The frogs themselves are toxic. If you stretch this leg out on this, it's got a nice yellowish color in the groin area. And this is not a frog you want to mistake as a leopard frog and put it in a bag or a container with other frogs, because chances are that the toxin will kill the other frogs. Once watched a black racer catch one of these, and it stopped with the frog sort of rear end first in its mouth, and it was just froze, like, my gosh, what have I bitten into here? And I was fortunate enough to see the chase and to catch the frog, had my camera and took some photos, and after a little bit, the frog wasn't struggling. It was as if it knew that, hey, this guy's gonna spit me out here in a minute. And he did. And the racer then started wiping its mouth side to side, like it just had something nasty in it, in his mouth. And the frog hopped away. So they are breeding right now. They have a low snore type call. And they frequently call underwater. So if you hear one calling, chances are it's closer to you than you think it is, because the call doesn't carry far in the air with them calling underwater. But fish tolerant, like I say, and the eggs are distinctive. They're more of a brown color and not black, like most of your ranted frog eggs. And they'll be in a nice clump, and usually then a foot to 2 feet of water. And most of the time down near the bottom and not up on the stem in the water. That varies a little bit, but normally you see them deeper. The leopard frog, again, this is a species that most people are familiar with because they're very common all across the coastal plain and up to the foothills of the mountains, where they're replaced somewhat by the wood frog. Western Piedmont, there's some overlap in the range of the wood frog and the southern leopard frog. But they are an aseasonal breeder. Any time of year when you get a big rain, they're likely be some of them laying eggs. There'll be nice clumps of black eggs, 3,000 to 4,000, maybe even up to 5,000 in a clump, two here side by side. And in the winter, they tend to lay these in very shallow water, but some with the top of the eggs actually breaking the surface of the pond. Up in warmer times, they usually go out in deeper water and lay them there. Color variations, a great deal. Some, a lot of them have some greenish, sometimes a little bluish color on them. This bronzy brown color. Normally have a whitish dot in the middle of the tympanum, which helps identify them as the southern leopard frog. There are a number of leopard frogs scattered across the country, and amphibians, Herpetologist pipiens, is one that was in the biological supply house trade. So if when you were in school and a teacher ordered frogs from Carolina Biological Supply or Southern Biological something, they probably got Herpetologist, a species that's not native to North Carolina. And then sometimes when the frogs were used in class, they got tired of them, they took them out and turned them loose, which they shouldn't have done here because they don't belong here. But most of those populations that started like that temporarily did not seem to take and died out. Now, a new frog for us, the Atlantic coast leopard frog. Herpetologist Alvin described it just a very few years ago. And it looks like we do have them in the northeastern corner of North Carolina, and still working to figure out just where they do occur in the state, whether they actually get back as far as the northeastern Piedmont. Right now, we don't think so. But up around Albemarle Sound in that area, we've got some frogs that show the characteristics of Alvin, the Atlantic coast leopard frog. So that pushed us up to 31 species in the state. And this is a work in progress now to sort of separate these out from the southern leopard frog. As you can see, there's not a lot of obvious difference. Back on the back of the bottom of the back legs, they have more of a black pigment with some white spots or blotches in it. Whereas on the southern leopard frog, it tends to be more white with some black little spots in it. More rounded nose, not this obvious light dot in the middle of the tympanum. So more to be learned about this one. The wood frog, mountain species, northern species, goes up to the Arctic Circle. This is the most northern amphibian anywhere in the world. To the extent they can, are noted for their cold tolerance. You can actually freeze one of them and they'll thaw out and still be kicking. The egg masses of them, once expanded, an egg mass can be almost a foot across, has a lot of gelatinous material around each egg. This mass over here, you can see the reflection of an individual standing over here, was well over 6 feet across. Probably several dozen individual egg masses in this, but this is fairly typical of this species. They'll get in a little ephemeral pond and a whole bunch of them will come in and they'll lay all their eggs right together. And strategy on this appears to be protection, one, from cold, and two, from drying out. Because these shallow ephemeral ponds, if you don't get good rain, they'll dry up. But with all that gelatinous material, some of the outside eggs may dry to the point that it kills them, but many of the ones down in there are protected more, and when the later rain comes along, they still can hatch out and grow up to be little froglets and metamorphose out of the pond. It's a neat species. They're hard to catch. They really are long jumpers. I've seen in the mountains and the roads at night crossing that one would come in on one side of the road, hit once in the middle of the road, and be out the other side. And so you can imagine trying to stop a vehicle and chase something like that down. It's not easy. The last of our branded frogs is the carpenter frog. And it's called the carpenter frog because its call sounds kind of like a hammer striking something. And so it's a coastal plain species, acid tolerant species. They can breed, and tadpoles grow up in water pH as low as around 3.8. And sphagnum choked ditches along roadways in the coastal plain most times are a good place to find these frogs. And their tadpoles are got some stripes on the tail and are fairly distinctive tadpoles. Okay, let's talk a little bit about if you want frogs in your yard. What you've got here is what we call our large yard pond in the backyard here at the house. My wife put this in, and got a couple different stages here. This shows that when we were cleaning it out one time, I emptied it to give you a feel. This is the sort of thing you buy at a Lowe's or Home Depot. The insert that you can dig into the ground. Here we combination dug in and built up a bit to set this one in, and then put some old wood stumps or cut pieces around it. Had a chestnut tree that a neighbor cut down, and these stand up nicely and last a long time before they rot away. They provide some cover, a place for lizards and frogs to sit on top of them, and then once it's aged a little bit, it looks like this. And in this one, we've had narrowmouth toads, Cope's tree frog, green frog, northern cricket frog, green tree frog, American bullfrog, southern leopard frog. All those breed in here, along with spotted salamanders. Now, a closer look at this frame right here, you will see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 frogs. And there, 5 of these are clearly green frogs, rhinoclamatans. This one is a little, I think it probably is also. It's a little hard to tell. There's a chance it might be a juvenile bullfrog. But right now, out back of the house, there are bullfrogs, green frogs, spotted salamanders are in the pond laying their eggs. And it's a nice little thing that a lot of birds come to drink water there, squirrels. It's just a nice amenity. Now, on a slightly larger scale, if you want to do more for amphibians, you can do something like this. This is out back in our field behind the house. And I did contracted a track hoe to come in. First thing I did is I cored the soils to see that I had good clay down there, something that would hold water. Got the track hoe in, and this individual was used to building ponds, but he was not used to building an ephemeral pond, one that is intended to dry up in dry times of the year. That goes against the mentality of most people that build ponds, and so you usually have to work with them a bit to get them to understand what you're trying to do. But I built this nice pond, and here's the basin when it was finished. Oh, about a year and a half later, it had filled up, but then it had a drought period and it dried down almost up. But for the last couple of years, it sealed a little better, and it stays either full like this or like up here in this larger photo most of the time. Right now, it's about halfway down with the drought we've had. And like I say, the American toads were in there big time last night. Got spotted salamanders laying eggs, spring peepers, upland chorus frogs, and southern leopard frogs, and the 2 pickerel frogs were calling last night. So there are 12 species that have all volunteered to come and use this pond. The species are quite diverse that depend on ephemeral and fish-free habitats. these are habitats that lots of times fall below regulatory standards for protecting them. And it's up to local individuals and individual states and stuff to try to provide some protection for these habitats, or you're going to lose a lot of the species. The Anderson's tree frog, our state frog, has reduced populations. We're concerned about it. Gray tree frog seems to be doing fairly well. They'll breed in a bird bath if you give them a chance. Gopher frog, very much trouble for that. Maybe salamander in trouble. Little grass frog, because they can take advantage of little habitats, sometimes roadside ditches, they're still okay. Upland chorus frog, not as common as they used to be. Lost a lot of habitat here in Wake County. Tiger salamander stayed endangered. They're in real trouble. Our state salamander, the marble salamander, still holding on fairly well, but losing some ground. Wood frog is one that we need more information on. Most of the people go to the mountains to look for salamanders and don't pay too much attention to the wood frog. Squirrel tree frog, hitchhike, they seem to be doing fairly well. Brimley's forest frog reduced, but still okay in lower coastal plain areas. The other species that isolated wetlands preferences, spotted salamander we mentioned. You like frogs, you kind of like salamanders, particularly these that use a lot of the same habitats, ephemeral ponds. Little Chamberlain's dwarf salamander, seepage areas they use for breeding. There's that southern leopard frog again, four-toed salamander. They lay their eggs in moss clumps overhanging shallow water on floodplains lots of times. And if with more flooding, their eggs get inundated before they hatch and they drown. Most times with big floods, it scours out the larvae and washes them down in the stream. They don't survive. So it's a state listed species of special concern. We've lost a lot of habitat for it. Little narrowmouth toad seems to be doing fairly well. The tadpoles grow fast. Under ideal conditions from egg laying to metamorphosis, it'd be 2 to 3 weeks. So they can take advantage of the sites that other species that require longer periods with water in ponds can't handle. Oak toads, spade-foot toads, these others, we've talked about them all. Now, in the Charlotte area, this is sort of a listing of the species that are likely to be there. We had a comment on their breeding time. Spade-foot talk about it's aseasonal, any time of the year. The American toad is late winter breeder. Fowler's toad usually about a month later than that. Cricket frogs, May, July. Coke straight-through frog, warmer season, April through August. Green, most of our frogs are spring and summer breeders. The spring peeper, here again, is winter breeder. And the upland chorus frog. Narrowmouth toad, again, summer breeder, late spring and summer. And your ranted frogs are all pretty much warm season, with the exception of the pickle frog, which is a March breeder, pretty religious on being in March. And the southern leopard frog, which is aseasonal. Again, any time of the year you get a big rain. But you should note, and I say, we'll know how to find frogs. Well, you got a good night like tonight, you go out and you listen. And if you can't hear anything from your house, you drive around a little bit and you try to not have too much rain coming in the windows of your car while you're listening. But that's one of the best ways to find frogs is to listen for them when they're breeding. And you should note that males of most species have a broader window for calling than females have for actual breeding or egg laying activity. And this makes perfect sense. If the females got to a site first, it doesn't do them any good. There's no male there to mate with. One male can mate with more than one female. And so if the males get there early and great blue herons eat some of them and snakes eat a few of them and stuff, they still, as long as there's some there, there's enough to mate with the females. And it's the female is the more critical one to try to minimize their mortality and have more than one opportunity to breed. So with most of your salamanders that breed in ephemeral settings, like the marbled and the spotted salamander and tiger salamander and so forth, they do the same thing. Normally the males show up first and then the females will come in later. So just because frogs are calling doesn't actually mean that there's actual breeding going on at that particular time. Okay. Mailed out some references to folks so they can supply them to whoever wants them. And at that
Okay, well, we have lots of questions. You still there? Thank you all for being with us tonight. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened where Alvin went. So I guess we'll just go ahead and end it here tonight. I'm sorry that we didn't get your questions answered. Maybe what we'll do is email them to him and maybe we can get some answers for you and send them back out. So I want to thank you for being with us tonight and hope to see you on April 12th when we talk about gardening in the shade. Thank you and good night.